Okay, well, let's see here. What do we have here? 5 o'clock. So get comfortable. Maybe if you want to grab a piece of paper or something, I end up delivering ridiculous amounts of information when I do these workshops and seminars because I really like to offer I call it the poo-poo platter. I like to offer a lot of ideas and information because I really truly believe that everyone is a completely different universe when it comes to grief. And the more we know and the more we understand and the more sort of ways we can approach grief, the more helpful we can be for people. And, it's such a unique experience. And if you've had any of your own loss and you've experienced grief, then you know it's not a cookie cutter situation and it's not something where one size fits all in getting the kind of support and help that you need. So let's see here. I am going to share my screen because I've got this handout. There it is. So let's see here. I want to say welcome to 3 Ways to Help Others with Holistic Grief Coaching. And I thank you for spending time with me so that you can learn about how you can help others with holistic grief coaching. And I do love sharing all of the possibilities of this really evolutionary work. And it's a really different way to work with grief and certainly different than what has been happening for the last 50 years in modern Western society. So I'm grateful for everyone that wants to help others by supporting them in grief in whatever way that you do that already. So I am going to dive right in here, let you know who you're working with here. I am Pamela Noxon, and I'm a trauma-informed holistic grief educator. I am a hypnotherapist, trained holistic health practitioner, grief movement guide, yoga instructor, art therapy practitioner, and a host of other things that I have added to my education so that I can help others in a very unique and authentic way in their grief. So I've been in the holistic field. I started in 1996. And I was teaching all kinds of modalities of emotional release work and touch work and yoga and all kinds of things that really were very holistic health care. And I've always been very interested in sharing everything I do. I was teaching 30 years ago, and I always want to be a part of helping people live a full and healthy life. And I found that for right now in our culture, the largest need is in the grief segment. Because I don't believe as a modern Western society in the way that we manage grief and loss, I really do not believe that we are serving grievers well. And I think the setup ends up leading to more pain, which certainly grievers do not need, more disconnection, more judgment, and really less wellness and less balance in their lives. So really, when it comes to death and grief, our culture has dropped the ball. So I'm hoping to be a part of making a change in that segment, in helping people, not only helping people in grief, but helping other people learn how to help others in grief, because there is a massive need. We are in a grief epidemic right now. There is so much loss happening with baby boomers parents, their peers, their partners. There is a massive amount of loss and a lot of people who need help right now. And it's only going to get larger as a segment in the wellness community. So this workshop is going to be 3 days in a row of about 1 hour. It might vary each day. Depending on how many tangents I go off on, because I get so inspired and then I think of other things. But so day number 1 today, and the way number 1 is helping others in grief, is approaching those in grief as unique individuals and from a holistic perspective, because grief affects every aspect of our lives. So it needs to be addressed on all levels of our lives: mind, body, emotions, spirit, and soul. So we'll also talk about how a holistic approach to grief makes all the difference to the griever. So if you're going to be working with people, or you're currently working with people, or you're doing volunteer work, or you have friends, family, any of it, approaching, supporting, and helping others in grief from a holistic space is a game changer. It really creates a different dynamic because the whole person grieves. So I'll start with a few of the ways that our modern society still gets grief so wrong, which, we are so advanced, and there's so many beautiful, wonderful aspects to being, in modern Western society. And unfortunately, approaching grief isn't necessarily one of them, although it is getting better. We are becoming more grief literate, and there are more people like you wanting to learn how to support and show up for other people in a better way, in a more conscious way that is loving, not timeline based. So one of the first ways we get it really wrong is forgetting that grief is natural. It is not an illness. It's not a brokenness. It feels like brokenness, but it is not a pathology. It's not mental illness. So grief is not depression. I don't know if you know this, but psychologists actually do not receive grief-specific training in their school for their degree, because it's not a pathology. They are doctors of mental unwellness, and so grief is not an illness. So I work with therapists, psychologists, MFCCs, and other people to help train them in my protocol, because they want to add that into their work, because they didn't get any grief specific training in school. Now that may be changing now, but it has not been that way. So another thing is not understanding that all grief, everything that grief brings to the table. So I made a little diagram for that I think helps really see it all in one place. Whoopsie. My little thing got ahead of myself there. So understanding that grief brings a lot to the table, more than just sadness. It's more than just our feelings or a broken heart over loss. So much more. Believing that grief can be fixed like a problem, and approaching it that way. Grief cannot be fixed. It cannot be taken away, and it cannot be healed. And in fact, we do not want to approach people to heal their grief, because grief is actually healing. The grief is the healing over the loss of the loved one. The grief is an essential part of the person's overall navigating this massive thing that has happened in their life. Assuming grief is linear time-based, that is chronos, as in chronological time. Grief is not time-based. Grief happens in this space that is timeless, just like, because it is love, grief is a form of loving. So love doesn't exist in time either. It exists in this deeper aspect. It comes from the heart. Grief comes from the heart, not the head. So it's not time-based. So misappropriation or misuse of that 5 stages grief work. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is an amazing doctor, did a beautiful study 50 plus years ago, and her work generated the 5 stages of grief. The challenge is that study was about, it studied people who had received their own terminal diagnosis. They were told that their life was ending. They had a life-ending illness, nothing could be done, that it was time to get your affairs in order. So she studied what they went through mentally and emotionally, and that became the 5 stages of grief. But the 5 stages model was never intended to be used for people grieving the loss of a loved one or something outside themselves. Unfortunately, that model, and even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said this is not what this was for, but it was taken up by Time Magazine, by to this day, people talk about the 5 stages. Oh, are you in denial? Are you in bargaining? Are you in anger? Are you in acceptance yet? It is not a model to be used in a holistic grief protocol. So another way we get it wrong is having little to no relationship with death in our modern society. Because we have taken death and put it so far away from ourselves, we as people we aren't around death and dying very often. Most of the time someone goes into the hospital or go into hospice and they're cared for by the medical culture, and 100 years ago, people passed at home, and the death and the dying and the loss was very personal, and we had a relationship with death and dying. Well, we don't have that anymore as a culture. We have a very antiseptic, hidden approach to death. The minute someone passes, they're taken to the morgue, and then the mortician makes everything, clean and ready for showing or viewing or any of that. It's just it has a very set protocol, and that we are never around, we're rarely around a body that no longer has a soul inhabiting it. And I will tell you now, if you have been around a loved one's body after they have left it, there is no question that that container is now empty. Everything shifts. You feel it, there is no question. And I think there's something psychologically important to that. And you realize that for tens of thousands of years throughout humanity, death was right there. Death was a part of life. And that's not very true in modern society, unless you are a Buddhist and you focus a lot on death. That is a more mentally healthy way to deal with death, because I hate to be the one to tell you this, but there is a 100% mortality rate amongst human beings. We will all deal with and face our own death. So another aspect of this is that death, I love Western medicine and I'm not impugning it. I believe that in a holistic program, there is room and space for all types of treatment. But death in the medical field is the one thing that is fought against at all costs. Of course, if you go into the hospital for something, you want them to do everything in their power to make sure that you get out of there and that you get better. That's their job. But what happens is, because it is all this fight for life, sometimes maybe over quality of life, but that is their oath, and their goal is to keep people alive and healthy. I do feel that the medical profession's relationship with death and quality of life is evolving. It feels different than it did 30 years ago. But what happens with this life at all costs mindset, which can occur, is that death can feel like failure instead of the natural progression and a part of life. So that's something that we want to be aware of, because all of these things, what we're looking for is we want to make sure that we are working with people to eliminate judgment, eliminate unhealthy guilt, and eliminate shame that is attached to grieving. Grieving is natural. It is one of the most natural things we do. So trying to plan it, line it up, put a timeline on it, or define it is not natural and is not healthy, and becomes stressful and shaming and guilt creating and judgment creating for the griever. So with that, and that comes with treating guilt as a solvable problem that can be fixed. That's a very Western mentality, is the fix-it mentality. And that it isn't something that can be fixed, and that can leave grievers feeling very lost and isolated and ashamed. Using toxic positivity with grievers, which is a very shallow form of spirituality, that, oh, they're in a better place, or, religion can use that sometimes. There can be spiritual toxicity, there can be spiritual whitewashing, there can be bright siding, which is sort of this fallout from the sort of positive mindset, which is a beautiful thing. Find gratitude. Do all those things have a place in a holistic life? They don't necessarily have a place in a holistic grief protocol because you cannot rush forgiveness, positivity, joy, any of healing, none of it. Which leads me to another thought. We don't heal grief. We can heal trauma and we can heal unfinished business, but we don't heal grief because grief is the healing, which I mentioned earlier. So we also want to make sure that we're watching for not healing as helpers and healers, as I like to call us, whether we're therapists or we're coaches or we're hospice workers or we're life coaches or we are, whatever on the spectrum of helping other people. We have to make sure that we do the work to heal our own pain and trauma, and that we navigate and deal with our own grief and our own loss in life. Because what you do not transmute or shift, heal, or change, you transmit. It may be non-conscious, and it usually is, but working with others in grief, you absolutely have to be navigating your own losses. That's a big part of my course, is actually helping you do your work so that you are the healthiest, most beautiful, dynamic, healed grief and grief understander, if that's a word, and griever that you can be, because that is a big piece of helping others, is the way you show up. Not just that you show up, but how you show up for them. You have to have your stuff in order. We're never perfect. It's a lifetime job, but that is a big part of my course, is really working with the loss and the trauma and the grief of your own life so that that can be transmuted and turned into the energy that you need to help others. So in Western civilization, we're so busy. We're just so busy. So sometimes it's very hard to show up for others authentically, especially for a lot of people, maybe the coworker or the family member, that they just don't want to hear the story one more time because they have their own pain that they don't take time out for. And it can also be a fear of intimacy, because showing up for others in grief is a very intimate thing to do. You really need to be comfortable showing up with someone who is dealing with maybe the greatest pain of their life. And that's part of my course as well, is that we really work on how do we show up for others without it overwhelming me. People say, Pamela, but I'm very sensitive. I'm a highly sensitive person, or I'm very intuitive, or I'm very empathic. I want to help others with grief work, but I'm afraid it's going to really take it all out of me. And I understand that completely, because 30 years ago, when I had my practice of emotional release work, working with doctors and therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists, I actually was overwhelmed by everyone's pain. I was getting it physically, I was getting it emotionally, I was dreaming about it. I was kind of drowning in it. And I knew I didn't have the tools to create the kind of boundaries that I needed to do that type of work. So over time, I shifted the way I was working, and I moved more into inspirational speaking and teaching healing arts. But coming back to this work decades later, as more of a grown woman, I have a different way to navigate this, because I've done so much personal work. And now I know the pathway to doing this grief work without it taking you out or burning you out, or without you being depressed all the time. People ask me all the time, like, gosh, that seems so sad. How do you do that? How do you focus on grief and loss all the time and trauma without being sad all the time? And I say, I take my holistic grief work very seriously, and I take living my life to the fullest and my joyfulness very seriously because I need them. That is the balance that we make sure that you create to be able to do this work well without feeling resentful of other people non-consciously or not wanting to show up or thinking, oh God, this is going to just be so painful, because there can be a high burnout rate if you don't do this work from a balanced place. We're teaching grievers to navigate grief in a balanced way. We need to be balanced too. And that means having a life. That means having vacations. That means spending time with those that you love. That means having alone time. That means having creativity, having joy. That means you having a full life. And that's one of the things I like a lot about this kind of work of grief coaching is that I control my schedule. I could not do this work in the regular therapeutic model of 30, 40 clients a week. Not going to do it. I have a different way that I need to work, and I prefer to work where I can have the amount of life in my life that I need to stay happy because I'm in this for the long haul, and I want you to be too. So another part of this is in Western culture is not having enough community or connection. And that is where we come in because we were built as human beings. Our nervous system, our brains, these have been developed over millions of years. They were built and created to live in community where if a loved one died, the community was there for support. They knew them too. They're grieving as well. We were built to live and function and grow and grieve in small communities. And we don't have that anymore. We have the whole world at our fingertips. And it can be very, very isolating for grievers. With the exception, of course, of support groups for grievers, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow in the workshop class tomorrow. Western civilization also kind of has a bit of a shallow cultural element to it that can value image over authenticity. Again, like if your life isn't perfect, you've failed. So grievers can actually come in to see you feeling like they've already failed because something bad happened in their life. That must be dealt with because having loss, having trauma doesn't mean you haven't manifested the perfect life that you want or you didn't vision board it right. That is a shallow understanding of things like the law of attraction or spirituality. We have death and trauma and hardship is absolutely a part of a full, healthy life. That doesn't mean failure. But to a griever, that can be overwhelming to then show up in a world where it looks like everybody has a perfect life on Instagram. So another aspect is that we can get overwhelmed. Everyone's, a lot of people are working 3 jobs just to afford to live, and our nervous systems can only take so much. We are also exposed to the weight of the world all at once, all day long. Oops. Sorry about that. And we are exposed to so much from the entire world all at once that we were actually not designed to handle that much trauma and grief and sadness. And of course, we then end up with, a lot of media. I'm not being political here. It's all over. A lot of media is so sensationalized that it really is designed to bombard your nervous system so that you are afraid to not find out what's happening every second and for fear of missing something because our nervous systems were designed to, boy, this thing is just hair trigger. I'm so sorry. Our nervous systems were designed to handle the weight of a small village or of a tribe. That we were not designed to take in so much pain and grief from outside sources. So that amount of grief and trauma coming in from all directions is overwhelming for our nervous systems. And I talk about this also again tomorrow in the day about trauma and grief. But our nervous systems are designed to keep us safe. They're designed to keep us alive. Hey, is that a lion? We better run. Or, gee, this place doesn't feel safe. Why don't I hear any birds chirping? That means there's a predator hiding in the jungle. That, our whole nervous system and our senses, everything about this system was designed to keep us alive because it's a very long time of developing this highly tuned system. But when we live in this modern Western society with all this overwhelm onto our nervous system, everybody on Instagram, everything on Facebook, news, 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 this went wrong, an earthquake in India, like all of it. And it isn't that we don't care. It isn't about not caring about the rest of the world, because of course we have to care about the rest of the world. It's about how much our nervous systems were designed to take. So one of the things I also do in the course is we find ways to use self-care for grief coaches that helps us not get overwhelmed by too much grief and loss and pain so that we can show up for others, but also how to help our grief clients with their overwhelm. Because I tell you, someone who is not overwhelmed by the pain of the world and the weight of the world and everything going on and in nervous system overwhelm approaches a major loss or trauma differently than someone who is already overly taxed and overwhelmed with so much trauma and grief and loss. So that's a real challenge of modern society, is to care for the world, which we do. That's why we want to do this work. And here it is, care for yourself. You must navigate your own self-care and have a balanced nervous system yourself so that you can show up that way for others. So another misconception, or another way that modern Western society gets grief so wrong, is thinking that all grief is the same. Even when it is segmented out as it is, as support groups still mainly do, that, I think the support groups of grief, I don't know this for a fact, I'm just going to guess here, I'm hypothesizing. I believe they must have been built on sort of maybe the 12 step and the addiction support group models. You've got, this is the type of issue, so we're going to keep it contained to only that type of issue. It may alcoholism or was it Narcotics Anonymous? Whereas today's grief support groups are sectioned out into the type of loss, not the type of people that are grieving, which would be a holistic way to do it, which is very needed. And I hope if you become a holistic grief coach that you will create your own healthy support groups that work for people for who they are, less than who they lost. Now, I'm not discounting who you lost. It is a huge aspect of grief. It's a huge aspect of a holistic grief approach, but it is not the only piece of the pie. There are some types of loss where it can be all the more important to be surrounded by others who have had that type of loss. Loss of a child comes to mind, mainly because the modern Western society has no way of dealing or showing up for that person when they say, oh yes, I lost my child. That people just, it seems it is so large to the other people who would ideally love to show up for that person, that they just don't even know they just don't even know how to hold space for that person. So some losses can be more isolating than other losses. But I studied with David Kessler amongst many people, many other trauma and grief specialists in our culture. And one thing David Kessler says that I love is so brilliant, because he's a psychologist and he's written a lot of books. He actually was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's protege, the doctor who came up with the 5 stages study 50 years ago. So David still works like within the stage model, David Kessler. But what he says when he's asked, what's the worst form of grief? He says the worst form of grief is yours. So these support groups that get broken out into type of loss are very helpful. but they are not structured to help each individual with their unique needs, which we will get to. I think one of my favorite examples is, let's say it's a loss of a partner support group. So many people in the support group may have had a beautiful, loving, connected relationship. There may be people in this loss of a partnership group who had a very difficult relationship with their partner. Maybe they were separated in the partner past. Like everybody's relationship would be different. The connection with the loved one who passed is different. Who the loved one was that passed is different. But separating the grief only into who you lost is just not enough. So thinking all grief is the same is one challenge. Thinking that all grief can be put into the type of loss is another challenge. So in a nutshell, some of the ways our modern Western society gets grief so wrong: forgetting that grief is utterly natural, not understanding that everything that grief brings to the table. I'm going to show you that in a minute. Believing that grief can be fixed like a problem, not understanding that grief is actually love and healing, and that grieving is the way that we heal loss. Grief is actually love. So we don't fix or take away grief. We support grief as a natural expression of the pain of the loss of a loved one. Assuming that grief is time-based, misusing that 5 stages study that was designed for our own mortality, not the loss of another. Having little to no relationship with death in our culture. Treating death as a failure, or thinking of death as a failure. I'm not saying that always happens in the medical sector, but it is kind of inherent in there that if all roads are to keep people alive at all costs, because that's the job, that's sort of a fallout that can happen. Treating grief as a solvable problem, that fix-it mentality, because that's how Westerners show up with grievers. They want to say the right thing, do the right thing. That is not holistic grief coaching. There is no magical thing you're going to say or do that's going to fix them and help them feel better. So one of the things we do in the course is we help train that out of you to show up completely differently as a holistic grief coach, using toxic positivity with grievers, not healing your own pain of loss or your own trauma, being too busy in our culture or being very non-conscious, not able to show up authentically, which I believe is sort of a fear of intimacy, because it is, I know, like one of, we're a culture that 6 people are in an elevator and no one can even look at each other. It's considered rude or weird. So, we're a very individuated society, unlike other cultures, sometimes like Asian cultures or Middle Eastern cultures or South American cultures, many cultures, they actually live with much less space between people. Maybe it's more like India, maybe it's more crowded. So they don't have this literally amount of space in between them and others. And I think that creates a different relationship with intimacy. So not having enough connection or community. We were built to live in small communities, small villages, small tribes. That's natural for us. And sometimes I feel like our nervous system just hasn't caught up with how big the world is for each of us, that we are overwhelmed and our nervous system is overwhelmed and it can only take so much. Thinking that all grief is the same. So holistic grief coaching requires a lot of personal work, because it is also about transforming you into the safe space that you need to bring and show up with for others in their grief. So everything in the course, the techniques and the information, they're there to help you support others with a conscious and loving perspective, not to fix them or take away their pain. So that can be very hard for empaths and codependents and highly sensitive people, because we're compassionate people. Compassion is love in action. Who wants to allow another person to be in pain? We want to help them with pain. But in this case, unlike other segments of mental wellness or life coaching, in this case, in grief work, taking away their pain truncates the actual healing experience, because grief is the way they heal the pain of the loss. So what we do is we learn to come from a place of connection and to be of real support to others. So being with someone in grief is a very intimate act of service, and it requires opening your heart in a safe way to help others deal with the pain that of loss that is part of the human experience. So if we were raised in a culture like modern Western society that did not train us to be comfortable with another's pain, or taught us to ignore it, or to bright side it, or to enmesh it with our own and try to take it away or take it on, then we need to relearn how to show up for others with compassion and with healthy boundaries, because we need to help grievers learn to swim. And they can read all the books and they can watch all the videos about swimming. But when you are in it and you are in the water, it's a whole different ballgame, because you need to learn to swim, and that is how they will navigate their grief. And that is true even without the loss of a loved one that has trauma or other aspects to it that make that loss traumatizing. So that's some of the ways that our modern civilization gets grief wrong. So here's a little bit of the types of grief. And this is, there's personal loss, obviously, the death of a loved one. Anticipatory grief is the experience of grief before the death. That's very common with Alzheimer's and dementia and long-term illness. There's traumatic grief, and I do a deep dive into the types of trauma in grief tomorrow on day 2 of this. But traumatic grief could be the way the loved one died was traumatic, the relationship was traumatic, or the death triggered old trauma. Delayed grief is that the person was not able to grieve in real time. I would think of something like someone in maybe a war zone, or if they're in survival mode, or they just had to get through something, they were unable to grieve in real time. And our emotions and any healing of trauma, healing happens in real time. You have to be in the present to heal trauma. So ambiguous grief is grief that's hard to see. Complicated grief has become a diagnosis just in the last year for mental wellness practitioners, psychiatrists and psychologists. Now, they define complicated grief as something where the symptoms aren't really evolving, but it's so vague. I kind of go either way on how I feel about the fact that there's a diagnosis of complicated grief now. On the not so great side, I don't like that grief would be pathologized in a mental illness practice. But on the plus side, that means people will, if there's a diagnosis, that means there's health insurance that will cover mental wellness treatment for people that need help in grief. The challenge, as I mentioned before, is that mental wellness practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, they do not receive grief-specific training in school unless they are in school. Like right now, that's a very recent thing. So most psychologists and mental wellness practitioners have to seek out grief training, because grief is not a pathology. It's not a mental illness. They weren't taught how to do anything with grief because there's nothing to fix or heal. So I'm a little come see, come saw about the cumulative grief in the diagnostic manual. Genetic grief, such a fascinating field. Genetic grief is the family inheritance of grief or trauma. That's a whole, that's an incredibly exciting field that's really coming out now with showing what is in our DNA. The more we discover our DNA, the more of a miracle we know we are as human beings. Collective grief, cultural grief, could be political grief. This is a loss suffered in a community. Now that could be war, but there could also be grief in a group. That can be something as specific as a movie star or a rock star passing where you never met them, but all of these fans experience this collective grief of this person that everyone loved or identified with. Abbreviated grief is a short-lived response to a loss, um, more like truncated. I think that's something to look at to make sure that the person has had enough expression and enough grief and enough of the evolution that we experience with grief, that is not just truncated grief, that someone's like, nope, I'm better, I'm fine, I grieved for a month, I'm back at work. That's repression, and that is not healthy. But it could possibly be that that with anticipatory grief, you've front loaded so much of the pain watching the person pass, losing that person to dementia or Alzheimer's, losing them before you lose them, that when the loss, the death actually occurs, the grief experience may not be, okay, I'm going to use a time word here, as long or as large as anticipated, and the griever may think there's something wrong with them. So this is something to look at and say, well, let's track this lifeline of your loved one. When did you start grieving their loss? Because I know I had a client that I worked with. Actually, this was someone I worked with in hospice. She was passing, and her mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's when she was 10, and her whole life was anticipatory grieving and watching her mother disappear and and die before she died. So this was so much, there was so much to tease out. There was also a very harsh religious component to her life. Um, it was a very punitive religion. So this freedom to grieve and love and feel was really an important aspect to our work. So disenfranchised grief is another type of grief, and that means loss that's been minimized, which in this particular example, in her more punitive religious upbringing and marriage, and she was still practicing this religion, that um, she wasn't really allowed this full sense of grief because she just had to be spiritual and be positive, and that's what spiritual toxicity is, that you're not able to just still feel it. Or what if you're mad at God for taking your person? I think that's a relevant reaction. But there are some environments where you simply aren't allowed to have an authentic grief experience, and that can cause a lot of challenge, and that can cause a lack of health, mental health, emotional health. So the other type of grief would be, this is more like, also like a secondary loss, would be the loss of a dream or identity or future. And we think of that as that um, the secondary loss could be the fallout, like if you losing a partner would be the loss of a dream. You had this retirement, you had this whole life plan together. Certainly with loss of a child, there is loss of a dream. There is loss of identity with the griever sometimes. A mother who loses a child will very often feel, I'm no longer a mother. And that loss of that identity needs to be grieved as well. So here's a little chart of all of the ways that grief and loss can affect someone's life. And that is physical health. People come in with symptoms or illness. Broken heart syndrome is a real thing, and it has physical ramifications. It affects work life, a life purpose. It has people feeling lost, imbalanced. It can affect mental wellness, relationships with family and others. People can have trouble functioning. They can be plagued by guilt. Whoopsie, this is a little hair trigger thing here. I am seeing that I've got, make sure I've got this. I want to make sure I've got us on mute here. Sorry, this should have automatically muted. I thank you all. Other ways grief can affect a person's life is with their spiritual connection. With they can be plagued by guilt. That's actually guilt becomes part of all grief experiences. We talk about that in the course of how guilt is actually a natural expression, a healthy amount of guilt. If guilt begins to move into shame or self-punishment, we need to watch out for that and help that person navigate a natural, healthy level of guilt. That sounds kind of odd. I don't mean guilty for the loss, but it's something, in a nutshell, it's something that the brain does to try to make sense of loss, because most of the time loss is something that we can't make sense of. Grief can affect how isolated we feel, how lonely we feel, our home life, our emotions and our emotional regulation, the way we care for ourselves, the way we handle change. It can arrest growth, certainly can trigger old trauma. It can affect our sense of self and our decision making. Grief affects every aspect of our lives. So I would ask you to ponder and make some notes and think about, well, how has any loss or grief affected my life? What areas was I affected in from the loss of a loved one? And so this is something I call the biosphere of a griever's experience. And so in here you see, I just wanted to make a model that showed all these different things that a griever is bringing to the table, and why a holistic protocol is, I think, the only compassionate way to help someone in grief. Because it's not just, oh, they're depressed and sad because they lost their loved one, or oh, they're upset and they're shut down, or they're in shock or lethargic and they can't function well. There's so much more to this. The previous losses that a griever has experienced inform the current loss. The culture they grew up in, their ethnicity. Different cultures treat grief differently. Their family of origin. How did the family treat death, dying, and grieving? Did you witness healthy grieving, or did you witness very shut down grieving, like we can't cry? They wouldn't want that. Or be a big girl and help out now. Like that whole family experience, if there was grief from a younger space, can really affect the current loss. Past trauma, a religion or belief system, the ancestral, the intergenerational grief, uh, grief and loss that was experienced multiple generations ago is still filtered down in the way a family deals with grief. And like I mentioned, the genetic component, which is just so fascinating. There is also this archetypal grief. There is the collective human experience that all humanity will experience: death, loss, and grief. So we hold that, we bring that to the table, even as an individual, this whole expanse that is loss and grief that exists in the world, in our society, but also just through all of humanity. Some part of our psyche and our subconscious has that aspect of grief as well. We have our identity, how healthy the griever was before loss, how regulated were their emotions, what was their life like pre-loss. If you have someone that was dealing with addiction issues before loss, you can imagine that their grief experience is going to be informed with who they were before the loss. So when I work with people, who they are and how they are is more important to me than when they are in a linear experience. If, depending on your belief system, past lives, karma, the death itself absolutely informs the grief. Obviously, a traumatic death is going to be a very different experience than an extremely peaceful loss or death where everyone knew it was coming. A surprise a car accident, something like you can see the way the loved one died becomes a big piece of the griever's experience of that unique experience of loss and the death of the loved one. One thing I do want to say, and even with collective loss, let's say it is a collective loss of maybe overlapping losses, or like I use 9/11 as an example often of all of those people at once dying, that kind of loss. We as human beings still grieve one loss at a time. We don't grieve in a lump. We separate out each loss and grieve. So if you have a griever that you're working with and they come in, they're like, but it was, the ice skating team that recently passed away. Each one of those losses needs to be teased out and grieved individually, because each one of them would be a different version of this multi-petaled flower because of the relationship that one would have had with each one of those people. Um, and So that's something very important, that even in collective loss, we do grieve each loss individually. So if you do energy work, sometimes I like to talk a little bit about the chakras. I'm going to wind this up in a little bit. I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I do work with, when I teach my course, the holistic grief coaching certification course, I work with, oh my gosh, I work with all spectrum of healers and helpers. I work with psychologists who want to just learn my protocol to plug into their existing work. I work with people who do hospice. I work with counselors. I work with people that are in hospice. I work with just anyone that is a healer and helper. That's why I call you healers and helpers, because it helps me just lump it together. Yoga instructors, energy workers, teachers, people that do support groups that want to bring a more holistic aspect to the support group, which is very doable. Bring the body, the mind, the emotions, the spirit, and the soul into that group. So if you like the language of the chakras, this is the way grief affects all of our energetic system. The first chakra, grief affects literally our sense of safety, embodiment, being here, and being alive. It's the space we take up. It's our being in our body. Trauma also affects that very much, because there's a detachment from the body very often in trauma, and so the embodiment work and the body work and the movement work is very powerful in the holistic protocol of working with anything that's affected the first chakra in grief. The second chakra is about our relationships and our connections with other people. Sometimes people feel that it's almost like this connection, this cord, this tether they had to their loved one is now just flying around with nothing attached to it. I work with the understanding that life, love, energy never die. It just gets transmuted. Now, that doesn't have to be a religion. It doesn't have to be science. It could be a combination of the two. It could be whatever language you put on it is fine with me. Because to me, I understand that at the very minimum, the love that the griever had for their loved one and the connection they had with them never dies. So rebuilding that connection with creativity is a very important part of my holistic protocol. And the second chakra is creativity. It's all creation. It's procreation. It is that area just kind of where the ovaries are, below the belly button, and it is this relation with others, connections, creativity, and making new life. Uh, More about that later. So the third chakra is right here at the belly. It's our sense of identity, the self, the ego. And I don't mean ego is not a bad word. Ego is identity. The ego is an important part of who we are as a person. So the way grief can affect the third chakra, though, is back to that identity issue. If you have someone you're working with where, it was someone that their identity was, like I worked with a woman whose grown child had passed away, college age child, and it and again, there's no timeline on any of this, but we learn ways to assess, is this a space that this person would be navigating in a healthy way, or would this be a space where they would have evolved this particular aspect of their grief? And she was years, years after the death, was still, I'm sorry to use the word still, was in this space that was very much about this identity of her loss of identity, was that she was no longer a mother. And in my work, what I would have hoped to, she was in a group with me and I was not the facilitator, so I was not able to take this farther. I pointed it out to the facilitator. Whether or not they took it farther, I don't know, because it was for confidentiality. But for me, I would have held space and offered her the option to have curiosity about how to be a mother in a more archetypal or a larger sense, to honor this love for her daughter. Because there is not just one way to be a mother. There's many ways to mother that become, you could mother the world, you could mother foster children, you could mother foster kittens, you could, there are ways to be moving that energy, because she was then so stuck in this torture, is the only word I can use, because she only had this one finite way of being a mother. Of course, she's always going to grieve the loss of her daughter. That's I want to make sure that I'm clear. It was the loss of her identity as a mother that was stuck, and that would be a third chakra issue. And so the other thing about the third chakra is, this is where our resilience is. This is our ability to show up for ourselves. And that's something that we want to help our grievers with, is that, of course, we want them to have all the support they can have in the world, support from us, support from family, others. But the fact of the matter is, out there in our society, there isn't a lot of support just standing on the street corner. That's why we need more holistic grief coaches. And what we want is, we want to help our clients find ways, in relevant ways, that work for showing up with where they are in any given time. We are not going, oh, I'm going to make you show up for this, do this, this, and this. We always show up and meet them where they are, so that we are honoring their experience and their process. But we want to have them find ways to show up for themselves, because grief is isolating in modern Western society, and there isn't enough community and support, because we aren't living in a small tribe where in the middle of the night the tribe comes into our home and rearranges every piece of furniture after the death of a loved one, so that we wake up and see that the community has showed up for us, and they've shown that everything is different, and that they're there for us and they understand us. So maybe you're lucky enough to have that small community that will show up for you, but we have to make them a lot of the times in modern Western society. I'm not knocking modern Western society. It's just, when it comes to grieving, that, there's a lot to be there's a lot missing. So then the fourth chakra is the heart chakra, which is our connection to love and to all of our feelings and all of our emotions. Feeling our feelings is obviously a huge aspect of a healthy grief experience. And a lot of times grievers show up with this very splintered or fractionalized or shut down heart chakra, because they have a fear that the love and the connection are just plain gone. Because the love is no longer in this physical container that they know. It is elsewhere, or the energy is elsewhere, or the love is elsewhere, the connection is elsewhere. And that makes me think back to that thing about death being so antiseptic and so removed and so hidden in our culture. If you have been around an empty container that is the body of a departed loved one, without doubt, some deep part of you says, well, they're not there anymore. They've gone somewhere else. I, I, I choose, again, your belief system is your business, as is every griever's. But connection to love and spirit, I believe, is part of a healthy, holistic grief protocol. This idea of nothingness. I don't think we were built for that as human beings. I do believe we were meant to have some relationship with something larger than ourselves. If you need that to be the universe or the creative force, that's fantastic. You don't need to put a face on it and build a religion around it, but that is a part of a healthy, balanced human being is physical, mental, emotional, and some sense of spiritual. I don't mean that religious. In fact, it is the opposite of religion. It is spirituality. So that connection and love are always present, and we may have someone with a heart chakra issue if they really believe the love is gone. The fifth chakra, grief affects the fifth chakra with communication and our sense of expressing sometimes. If we don't feel it safe to express our feelings and our sadness or to tell our stories, we need to tell our stories. That's a huge part. That was the original healing for humanity for tens of thousands of years, was sitting around the fireside telling the stories. That's how we taught next generations. That's how the shaman or the medicine woman or whoever was the leader of the tribe, group, village, it would be the sharing of stories. We are built to share stories. So if our griever doesn't have the opportunity to express themselves, that's unhealthy. And that could block the fifth chakra. But the fifth chakra also has a lot of things about being in control of life and the sense of fairness and justice as well. So there's a lot that goes on in the fifth chakra with grief. Sixth chakra, the third eye, is our sense of reality and our perception. And this is where we might get knocked off center in where we fit into the scheme of things, or what is life about? What is going on? The fifth chakra can be that wasn't fair, the death of my loved one, I'm angry, that's not fair. But the sixth chakra is why? Why? Why my loved one? And every griever has this sense of wanting to know why. And the challenges in the physical incarnation of living as a human being, that we don't get all of the answers when we are human. So sometimes we have to help our clients navigate the need to know why without necessarily ever getting a hard answer. And we help them to become more connected to their inner source of their own guidance and their own version of spirituality and their own answers, because you don't have the answers for them. And this isn't a religious program where a pastor, clergy, rabbi, imam, group leader would say, well, this is why. This is spiritual, not religious. So we're not coming up with why. We're helping them navigate why and find their own why. So then the seventh chakra is that connection to spirit with that Gus, God, the universe, spirit, the creative force. Grief can certainly put people, even devout people, into a spiritual crisis. It absolutely can create a scenario where I personally think with a lot of grief and loss, there is a piece of us that wants to go with the loved one. And that piece is something that we want to work with. Now, I'm not talking about suicidal ideation. I'm not talking about wanting to end one's life. I'm talking about the spirit and the chi and the life force and the energy that we want to follow. We want to be with our loved one. And if we don't see them here, well, what do I do? So we want to work with our clients to have their energy be here, be now, like in the first chakra, and work through any life crises or any sort of ennui that they may experience. Ennui is a French word of that, well, what's the point? What's the point? Like a life depression of why bother? Why bother to go to work? Why bother to bathe? Why bother to try or do anything? We're just gonna die anyway. Like this kind of spiritual crisis, instead of continuing to live on all levels, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, we want to work with our clients with that seventh chakra issue. I don't actually use the chakra language all that much, so I'm kind of, maybe one of you really responds to this. So I thought it was funny that I added this in here. I was like, oh, we added the chakras. So then I added an eighth chakra in here. And the eighth chakra is a lot, now different belief systems have different numbers for this, but my holistic work is physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. But there is a fifth dimension, if I may, to my holistic work, and it is internal alignment. This inner aspect of our self and our soul self, and all of these aspects getting lined up. Because when one or more or a combination are not balanced and they're not lined up, problems ensue. A lack of wellness ensues. And that can be physical symptoms, mental symptoms like anxiety, depression, insomnia, repetitive thoughts, invasive imagery. There could be emotional regulation issues where we're not feeling anything or we're feeling everything at once, or there's rage attacks, or, most grievers come in terrified to feel their feelings because they're afraid if they feel all of it, it'll never change. They'll never stop feeling that sadness. That is not true. And in fact, feeling your emotions in a healthy way is the way to navigate getting to more and more balance with our emotions. And then, of course, the spiritual aspect of staying connected to your loved one, keeping not only understanding that you're always connected, but that love and connection can actually be built on and can grow. I don't know a griever that I have worked with or spoken to or heard of that did not want to hear from their loved one after they passed. Oh, 66% of people polled have said that after their loved one passed, they felt that they heard from them as a sign, a symbol, a dream, something. And that is the spiritual aspect of the work. We can't, unless you're a medium and that's the work you do, which is beautiful and amazing. I have I do a lot of intuitive work and I have a lot of experiences, but I don't present myself that way because frankly, the pressure of guaranteeing that just sounds awful. So it comes up a lot in my in-person work, especially, but it's not something, I don't sell it, don't talk about it to clients. It's just not, but helping our grief clients be as open and connected and loving and with their loved one who has passed. That is our task, because the more connected you are, the more these things happen. The more the love is felt, the more the connection is felt. And I believe that is creating fertile ground for more and more connection. So that's looking at these things as the chakra. And from the viewpoint of the chakras, I think today is the longest of the 3 days, so I hope I'm not wearing you out. The holistic approach to grief is that we're honoring all aspects of our being and of their being. And we're using this approach to help people navigate their grief and find support, because there's no quick fix. We're working with the emotions because all emotions get equal time in a holistic model. We are making sure that they're not judging different emotions. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel nothing sometimes. So we go through the whole emotional wheel in the course. We go through sometimes identifying emotions. One of the challenges of working with grievers is sometimes they do not present well. They don't know what they're feeling. They don't know what they're thinking. They don't know what they're experiencing. It's so overwhelming that they don't even know where to start. So I teach you skills and techniques and tools to not only do a good assessment of body, mind, emotions, spirit, where this person is based on what you've learned and what you can pick up on. And that's not woo-woo, that's just tools and techniques, from language to energy level. There's a lot of that. A lot of different tools in that. It's so exciting. But we are also, there's another aspect I do where since I used to do so much body and touch work, combined with emotional release, there are things that the body does when someone is emotional, or when they're repressing emotions, or when they are expressing emotions. So we learn those lovely clues so you can help people have a healthy emotional experience in grief. We work with the mind. We work with trauma work. The aspects of the mind as like anxiety, repetitive, the inner critic voice, oh my gosh, that's shame, self-judgment, blame, guilt, intrusive thoughts and images. We do a lot of work with trauma. Now, I am not a therapist. I am not a doctor. One of the reasons I look for any possible trauma with grief clients is to see if I need to refer them to work with a licensed mental health professional along with me. So that's really important to at least be able to identify if you feel that there might be trauma there. We go into a deep dive into trauma in grief tomorrow. Working with the body, symptoms, the body as this beautiful, incredible, utterly honest voice of the subconscious. The subconscious is where our emotions live. It's where our spiritual connection lives. It's where every single little mechanism that runs the health of your body is. It's where dreams are. It's wherever the subconscious is 90% of our mind, whereas the conscious mind, the ego or identity, is only 10%. So the body becomes a tool for the subconscious mind to express itself very clearly. So we get good guidance from the body. We also can then use the body as a tool, because all of these things, they're ways that grief expresses, but they are ways that we can use tools to go in. So it's like a two-way street with each person. So the body is an incredible guide. I call it the Ouija board. Like, the body is always communicating what it needs. Whether we're listening or not is really the problem. So then the holistic grief approach is also, like I said, that spiritual, the personal relationship with God, universe, spirit, with the self as well, with the connection and the relationship with the loved one who's passed on. And, I think a holistic approach is especially good for people who have walked away from an organized religion. Not that it's not good for people who are in that practice a religion. That's fantastic. We just allow, and they work with whatever belief system, whatever they believe happens after we pass, because the religious aspect becomes more about the death and what happens to the loved one after they pass. But it's less about, unfortunately, how to deal with grief, other than, oh, well, you just have to be okay with it because they're, with God now. There's more to it than that in a healthy grief experience. Yes, you can believe that they are with God now. That's a beautiful belief. But that doesn't necessarily magically make the grief go away. So we have people who are being beautiful, devout, loving people in their religion, and they don't know what to do with all the pain and the grief, because they're thinking, well, I must be a bad whatever, Christian, or, I'm not doing this right because I should not be in pain. No, the pain is the natural human part of the loss. So helping people, if you work with a religious group or you're in one, if that's your belief system, helping others with that to be able to navigate their grief without all that self-judgment and that blame and shame and guilt, that's going to help them have a much healthier grief experience by bringing in other aspects. But it does also really work well. The holistic approach works really well for people who they're spiritual, but they're not necessarily in any organization. We really want to learn our own language of symbolism and spirit and dream work and guidance. That's a part of what I teach in the holistic grief approach. Then, of course, there's the inner alignment, which is this authentic self, our inner children. Healing inner child work is huge in grief, especially if the client had loss as a child, or they had a loss of safety or trauma as a child. There's a lot of personal development work in my course, like I said, to show up as a healthy grief coach for others, you need to be working on your own stuff. You need to be healing your own trauma, or identifying it, or assessing it, or forgiving yourself, or loving yourself, or doing better self-care, or working on anxiety and working on guilt, blame, self-judgment. And these are all a big part of the course. You wouldn't think they would be, but this inner alignment for you is every bit as important, if not more important, than the work you learn, which you also learn, of how you're showing up for others in grief. So that the way you hold space is just as, if not more important, than the tools and the techniques of what to do with the griever, not to them, but with them. And then there's soul work. And that is really this evolution of self. And this is really about being very connected and unconditionally loved. And it's about holding love over fear and understanding that life is stronger than death, and that honoring death is natural. And that's really a deep soul approach to grief. So that is what a holistic approach is. It addresses a unique relationship with the loved one for the griever. This is just a little wrap up here. I'm going to do it. Yes. Okay. This is the last slide for the holistic grief approach, what it means, that it addresses the whole unique individual, that it offers a healthier grief experience as that more whole, round, spherical model, which, by the way, is constantly changing. It's constantly expanding. It's cycling back. It's spiraling through its evolution. It's everything but a straight line. So it's so important. If you have one takeaway today, it's to remove that fix-it mentality of what can I do to make this better, or how can I fix this like it's a problem. That is number one. It doesn't work because grief isn't a problem. So a holistic approach understands that grief affects all aspects of a life. It treats the whole person and their life experience that preceded the loss. It approaches a griever's experience as a very unique one, and it honors the type of loss as one aspect of grief. A holistic grief approach becomes tailored to identify and meet each griever's individual needs. So you're going to have this beautiful toolbox and this whole pantry of ingredients to bring together a custom recipe for each person you work with. I think that's extremely exciting. And you can only imagine what that would feel like compared to someone trying to stuff their whole experience, that giant life experience of grief, into a little square hole that is what most approaches to grief offer. We form ourselves like big, beautiful arms around their grief experience to create a safe container that is compassionate and loving with healthy boundaries, that understands that who they are and how they're doing without judgment is the way to help them and to help them find support in grief. So holistic grief coaches do their own healing work and address their own grief to be able to help others, to help them heal a life around a loss and integrate loss into life. Those are two very important aspects of holistic grief. You've probably heard that model that grief is like a black ball, and you are a box around the black ball. And immediately after the loss, that the black ball just fills up the box, and it touches everything on the inside of the box, and it's constantly sad and present and depressing and triggering and traumatic and all of those things. And then that other model, which I'm going to seg into, that over time the box grows. The grief doesn't grow, it stays the same. That size of that as a black ball in the box stays the same in this example, but that over time that the box grows, and sometimes it's rolling around in there and it's a birthday and it hits the wall and you're overwhelmed and you're in that moment again. It's not like, oh yeah, that was their birthday. It's very present as if it just happened. That's very common. So this this helping our clients heal their life around loss. Remember, we're not healing grief, but we're healing around it. That would be healing trauma, and that would be finding ways to help them expand that box around the grief. And what are we filling that space with? We're filling it with love. We're filling it with connection, and we're filling it with living their life and living all aspects of their life. So we look to help our clients expand that box, that they're not staying for decades in that activated, immediately following loss space, because that's not a healthy grief experience. There isn't time, there is evolution. And I think that's a big distinction between the two. So we also help them integrate loss into their life, which means that it's like breathing. There is life and there is loss. There is life and there is loss. That it is this, if you will, that great karmic wheel of death and life. That is the human experience. And integrating their loss and losses into their life, we have tools to help our grievers do that in a healthy way that doesn't push them or shame them or rush them. A holistic grief approach respects science and all other forms of healing and belief as part of the whole treatment plan for a griever. So I personally feel that a holistic grief coaching is a good fit for anyone in grief because it honors the whole person as a unique individual and their life experience. I do know that a holistic approach is especially helpful for trauma survivors, PTSD sufferers, HSPs, highly sensitive persons. That's about, I think it's like 17% of the population they estimate is a highly sensitive person. Someone who takes things, that's like empaths. And I know I'm a highly sensitive person. So that can come down to foods and allergies or the way you perceive things or the way you handle things emotionally. There are tests for that, which are fascinating if you Google highly sensitive person. Fantastic book by a therapist who understood this to be a segment of the population. Turns out highly sensitive persons, two fascinating facts. Evenly divided across men and women. That's good news. And also across species. They found in their studies that there were, I do apologize, I've forgotten the percentage, it might even be 20%, somewhere in between 50 and 20% were highly sensitive. But they're studying monkeys and watching them, and 20% of them are caretaking the other monkeys. They're a monkey, one's hurt, and they're going to help them. That this highly sensitive trait, I think, is a more evolved trait. It is a more compassionate, more empathic, more sensitive person. That is usually who gravitates towards healing and helping, like you. So I find that the holistic coaching model is particularly effective in working with HSPs and working as an HSP, because I work in a way that is contained and safe and compassionate and loving. So it's really good for empaths, introverts, codependent people, just because what we work with, we're also looking, when we're doing that assessing, like we want to make sure that whatever dynamic is happening with the client stays healthy and with good boundaries, that they aren't trying to people please us, or they aren't trying to do what we want them to do. That happens a lot with grievers because they don't know how to grieve. We haven't taught anyone to grieve in our culture. So they're coming in saying what we think they need to say, and we want to be like, where's our little BS meter, If you could say that a different way, or you didn't have to say it in that way, what would you say? We want to help them have an authentic experience. It's very good for dissociated or dysregulated grievers and people who find support groups to be a challenging place to get their needs met. So I would offer you, bring some curiosity to this. Email me, text me, message me, let me know. If you want to text me, I can text you all my work number, or you should have my email to respond to, love@mourninggoods.com. If you have any questions about any of the material, and just come up with what does this mean to you. That's the most important way to approach this work, because to do this work as a passion instead of as a job, this work, when you do it authentically and when it comes from a place where you're taking your life experience, your loss experience, all of these things in this first model of what it means, what a griever, the biosphere, this is you as well. Your life is in here in this work. You cannot do this work well if it's only about the client. You can't do it. This has to be about you as well, because it can be challenging. And you're showing up with all of this. These become your superpowers. You do this work authentically, and you end up, it's really incredible and beautiful. The more authentic you are, the more of the right client gets drawn to you, because you are the right fit. If you're saying, okay, well, I'll use me, I'm an ex-Catholic, part Native American person who's very spiritual dynamic, is very much about nature and animals, that I have a very mothering archetype, I have a very teacher archetype, that, you know, that I've had this much past trauma and this much past loss, and this is, you know, the relationships that I've had with the people that passed. This is my life before loss. All of these things to me inform how I show up for my work with clients. And what that does is, the more authentically you work and the more of a deep dive you do of that inner alignment and that inner authenticity work, the more effortless your work becomes, because it flows out of you. You are not pushing a rock up a hill every day. You are being the best version of you. And that's the most important thing that you can bring to holistic grief coaching. And I thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, same time. And I will be going live at 5 o'clock. And let me know again if you have any questions. And tomorrow's class is about trauma showing up in grief, and the 4 ways actually that trauma is a part of grief. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for helping others in grief. And again, I'm Pamela, your trauma-informed holistic grief educator, and I look forward to seeing you again. You let me know if you want to jump on a call with me. I'm also always happy to answer questions in a free call to make sure that I've communicated things properly. And always, 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 if you have questions about the course or my other work, you let me know, we can jump on a call. So take care. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you.